Lovely to see, lovely to see so many people here this evening. I was panicking that our speaker, James, was getting towards the stage where I might begin to panic, and then he had the best possible excuse. He was picking up a load of sea bass, which are now in the car park in the back of his... selling them afterwards. So thank you very much for coming, and that just reflects the fact that you're very busy. You run a shop, you've got a whole lot of businesses, you've got all these academic things you do with Bangor University. You're an extremely busy person, and so we're very, very grateful for your coming. Your farming in the Menai Strait made much more difficult, I think, by Brexit, but whether you can overcome those problems, we will hear about, no doubt. And you have all these connections with Bangor University doing research. You've got an amazing 4 degrees, I read, which is astonishing. And we're very grateful to have you here. So we're going to hear about the Crown Estate. James also has lots of experience of farming in the Menai Strait and of this new project about using the space adjacent to or inside wind farms for other purposes, because there's lots of seabed there which could be used, which is not very navigable, I presume, and so that's an issue which is interesting. And this, some of you may be aware, this very big case that I think you were involved with, but certainly you know about, the Menai case, which was a big legal case involving, well, you'll have to tell us, but I think rights to fisheries and so on in that area. So, and starting off with this account of the Crown Estate, which is got all these rights over seabeds and how that's going to work in the future. So there's lots to talk about, and over to you. Thank you very much.
Hold your cheers until the end. Really, you'll be screaming to get me off. So I just want to get my caveats in first of all. This isn't by any means a definitive account of the Crown Estates. That would take too long. You need a legal scholar. I'm not a legal scholar, and so that's one caveat. Think of it more of like a scratch on the surface of what the Crown Estate is, given by somebody who bites their nails. So a very light touch view on the Crown Estate. So what is the Crown? Well, the structure of the talk by just explaining what the Crown Estate is, where it comes from, its history, what assets it has, and then move on a bit more to how that intersects with my world in the marine environment. Okay, so let's get going. Okay, so Crown Estate. This is from the front page of their current annual report. So it's an interesting body. It comes from an Act of Parliament. Hear more about that in a little while. But it operates very much in the private sector and has a very private sector kind of drive associated with it. It's essentially a large property company. Historically, it had holdings in across the UK in the rural area, so lots of farmland and lots of very valuable property, mostly in London, but also in other big city centres around the UK. And it owned the foreshore, or it would claim ownership over the foreshore. So the foreshore of the sea is that bit between sort of low and high water mark on the seabed. It currently has offices, its main office is in St James's Park in London, very swanky place, a very big building, a building it owns, but it rents out to other high blue chip clients. And recently opened an office in Cardiff, not coincidental to some of the things we'll talk about maybe later on, I think. Okay. So where does it come from? We live in a monarchy, right? The region of the time often did things which cost a lot of money, have wars, build palaces, things like that. So largely until Parliament became a force, those things were paid for by the population. The Crown owned, through forfeiture or other methods, lots of land and property. And in the 1500s, when Parliament started to flex its muscles, it decided that these needed to be organised in some way. Whilst Crown lands go back to the time of the Domesday Book, these need to be organised in a more structured way. So these Acts of Parliament were created called Crown Land Acts. The first Crown Land Act was in 1569, and there have been many subsequent Crown Acts since then. And so what the Crown Land Acts did is they operated as a trust estate that allowed the sovereign to carry on maintaining ownership of his or her assets, but most of the income that was derived from the use of those assets was then given back to Parliament, some of which was redirected back to the sovereign through the civil list. So at the time of the Crown, the 1950s, end of the Second World War, the Crown Estate consisted of a large holding of land, some nearly 400,000 acres, and lots of property in London, Regent's Park and Hyde Park, Windsor Park, all the royal parks. And it also owned all the royal forests around the UK. It was organised in a very disparate way, wasn't very efficient, didn't bring a lot of money. It was managed in a very haphazard way by civil servants and various members of the royal household. And so after the war, with the new awareness of social need, the government at the time, led by Sir Anthony Eden, commissioned a man called Sir Malcolm Tristan Eve, who incidentally was a cousin of Alan Turing, to write a report on what to do with these crown lands, how to make them more efficient, more modern, more purposeful. And so this report was commissioned, produced a report in 1955, and it found, unsurprisingly, that an absolutely new structure was needed to manage the purpose of these crown lands. So the recommendations were to modernise fast, and increase professionalism. The main way they did this was through statutes. And so this statute, the 1961 Crown Estates Act, is the foundation statute of what the body that we know of as the Crown Estate today. And it was not a long piece of legislation. It has 15 particular sections to it. But the most important sections are the ones at the beginning. So the section 1, subsection 1, describes what the Crown Estate must be, which is a body corporate, but charged on behalf of the Crown with the function of managing and turning to account land and other property rights that the Crown held. The most important section of the Act, from my perspective, I think from many others, is the general duty. So the general duty of the Commissioners, whilst maintaining as a estate in land, is to maintain and enhance its value and return obtained from it on the basis of good management. So what that means is that the Crown lands must always be run in an effective, efficient way, but mindful of the fact that they needed to generate revenue. So they needed to develop. There was no legal statute connection, no interference with that Act until this year, when the Crown Estates 2025 Act was passed by Parliament. Many amendments were proposed, not many were taken on board. Lots of reasons for that, some of which we'll discuss again later on, particularly in respect of devolution of the Crown to Wales. But two of the most interesting ones from my perspective as somebody who works in the marine environment was this new duty to undertake all its activities in light of the government's need to achieve sustainable development, which is a much more direct and precise way of describing good management in a modern context. And more interestingly enough, is Section 5, which introduced a new section into the original Act, Section 3B, which provided a restriction on permanently disposing of interest in seabed. Now, this came from nowhere. Nobody had talked about any disposal of seabed in the past. It hadn't been generally done. But this was inserted into the Act as a deliberate thing for a reason, and perhaps we can touch on some of those later on. So when the Crown Estate was originally formed in 1961, it was run by a group of people called commissioners. These were public appointees, and in 1961 there were 8 commissioners. The recent Act has increased that number to 12. it describes itself as a statutory corporation that operates in the commercial world, but with a perspective that's pan-country, but with an obligation to provide its excess revenue back to the Treasury. Things have changed over that time frame, obviously, and in the marine world, the things that have triggered most change have taken place in this millennium, certainly. So the Energy Act 2004 provided for what's called the Renewable Energy Zone, which is a piece of, which is a way of describing the UK's area between the 12 and 200 nautical mile limit. It wasn't described properly in statute before. And then the Climate Change Act, which committed the UK government to achieve less than the Climate Change Act, which Section 1 duty in that was the UK had to produce a net carbon budget which was 80% less than the baseline achieved in 1990, or found in 1990. That's the thing that opened the door to the development of offshore wind farms, both those pieces of legislation. Historically, of the three estates that the Crown had, the rural, the urban and the marine, the urban was always the most important, the most valuable. The rural came second, and the marine portfolio was a long way distant back. As recently as 2005, the value of the marine estate that the Crown held was £90 million for the entire UK seabed. The Climate Change Act considerably changed this. We'll see some figures in a little while about that. Some of the things have focused the Crown's mind over the past little while. Most negatively was the separation of the Crown Estate Scotland from the Crown Estate abroad. The Crown Estate Scotland had always had a different kind of remit because Scottish law is slightly different from English and Welsh law. But when the Scottish Government took in-house that requirement, that was a fundamental rupture in the way that the Crown Estate overall thought and subsequently have acted. So anyway, we move forward to 2025, and now the Crown Estate's focus, instead of being directed entirely on the terrestrial environment, is much more aligned with wider government policy. So it's very much sees itself as a key actor in delivering energy security, meeting net zero requirements, whilst also ensuring that the biodiversity of the marine environment is protected and restored, whilst giving back more to the people that live in coastal communities, particularly, and delivering increasing financial value to the UK. So in terms of comparative values, in 1955, the overall value of the Crown Estate was estimated by the Eve Commission to be worth £2.5 million. So with inflation, that amount that is equivalent to, I think it's £385 million in 2025 money. Whereas in fact the Crown Estate has a value at the moment estimated conservatively at 15 billion. So has the Crown Estate been a success in achieving excess value for the Crown lands? I think absolutely, without question, it has achieved a massive increase in value. Some of that has been circumstantial, but you know, I mean, these things happen. So in terms of the comparative values between the different sectors, then you'll see that urban is still the major component of the Crown's portfolio. Significant value. Again, most of this property lies in London, but some lies in Manchester, some in Leeds. Edinburgh was a big part of that portfolio too, but not so much anymore. The regional valuation refers to the other urban areas. So not insignificant, £1.5 billion, but certainly nowhere near London's value. The rural estate, which in former times was the I suppose the main driver in terms of the character of the Crown, has been relegated to a distant third, and it incorporates the Windsor estate. So its value is 1.5 billion, their estimate, makes a profit of 23 million or so per year. Again, not small beer, but nothing much. The Marine's very interesting. So the Marine, which, as I said, was in 2005, was valued at 90 million, is now valued at 3.4 billion. Last year it was valued at 4.4 billion. There's been a readjustment due to some of the issues that the Crown has faced in terms of successfully leasing its floating offshore wind farm sites. But it made last year more than £1 billion in profit. So the Crown's total profit, for total net revenue profit for last year, was 1.1 billion. So £1 billion of that, except the costs haven't been taken off, but came from the Marine. So it's a really significant part of the Crown's portfolio now. And of course, the values of the Crown estate aren't just the monetary values, but also the values that it expresses to the people that it employs and the people that it deals with. So it has a very modern view of the world now. So in addition to helping the UK meet the challenges of climate change, it's committed to be at the forefront of terrestrial environmental restoration. 15% of its land, it has about 200,000 acres at the moment. They have directed towards nature recovery schemes. It is institutionally committed to all the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and it has a strong sense of social impact principles embedded in its operational activities. So kind of interesting, very modern, very good. So onto the Marine. So the marine environment is a very interesting part of the Crown's portfolio in lots of different ways. It's interesting in respect of the general duty that we talked about before. It's the only statutory body that operates in the marine environment that has an absolute duty to develop. Most of the other statutory bodies that have remits inside the marine environment will be looking to develop, but in line with other requirements. The Crown's duty overrides all that. It is just looking to develop. So for wind farm operators or data cable layers, or it is keen to make sure that that activity is facilitated because it needs to return value. Of course, it's not able to abdicate itself from the responsibility of all the other statutory objectives, but it makes it a very interesting organisation in the marine environment in that sense. It's also very interesting because when we think about the land or the property that the Crown has, much of the terrestrial property has been acquired through purchase or through history or through conquest. In the seabed, the Crown's just been lucky. So it always claimed ownership of the foreshore, and it was quite aggressive in terms of how it would try to ensure that its rights were supported. But many other coastal landowners also claimed rights over that, and through a series of protracted legal cases, the amount of the foreshore that the Crown owns is about just over half of the foreshore around England and Wales, so about 55%. But in terms of what happens underneath the sea, they own it all. They own it all. It's theirs. But it's not theirs because they bought it. It's theirs just through royal prerogative. Prior to the beginning of the Second World War, the extent of a country's sea used to be considered measured in a very arcane way. It was effectively as far as a cannonball could be fired. It sounds funny, but I mean, up until the 1940s, this was the general principle. So that equated to 1 or 2, sometimes 3 nautical miles away from the coastline. During the Second World War, obviously territorial extent became a bigger issue. The United States, Chile, Peru all started to take unanimous approaches to how they perceived their marine territory to exist. That led to various conventions post-Second World War. The Continental Shelf Convention in 1953 actually defined the 3-mile limit as being acceptable as a territorial area. People were already moving to 12, so it's another case where bureaucracy was falling behind the reality. Then came this thing called UNCLOS 3, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. They call it 3 because it was the third one. That first one was 1958, second was 1964. Both were conventions that talked for years and years and years and years and didn't reach any conclusion. The 1985 one actually did reach conclusion. So that described 4 areas of the seabed: the foreshore, the continuous zone, the territorial seas, and what they described as the exclusive economic zone. So the foreshore continuous zone, that was the 0 to 3. The territorial seas encompassed the 0 to 12, and the exclusive economic zone was the zone beyond the 12-mile territorial waters. And there was a distinction described in between those, with the 0 to 12 and 12 to 200, in how a coastal state could express its rights. And so in the 0 to 12, the coastal state has what's called sovereign rights. It can basically do whatever it wants inside those areas. Between 12 and 200 miles, it has what's called sovereign user rights, which means it can do certain things with it that come under the framework of the convention, quite wide things, but those things often needed to be enabled by specific pieces of statute. So that's great. In 2004, the Energy Act, so the Crown Estates have ownership absolutely out to 12 nautical miles inside the territorial waters. The Energy Act 2004 increased that ownership for the purpose of renewable energy exploitation out to 200 miles. And then the Marine and Coastal Access Act then also described in 2009, also further emphasised that 200 mile by actually bringing onto statute the idea of an exclusive economic zone. So it can be used for renewable energy and other things now. So, but the Crown doesn't own everything. The Crown owns things, some things, but not everything. And there are certain what are called inalienable public rights, but maybe they're not so inalienable. An inalienable right is a right that can't be extinguished, but I think it's debatable whether that's the case for these rights anymore. And in the UK, through history, we have 2 inalienable public rights: 1 of navigation, and 2 of fishery. So the public fishery rights extend back to the time of Magna Carta. That's been confirmed through several cases, including our own, which we can touch on a little bit. But the principle of freedom of navigation is a much more universal freedom. The Crown's ownership of the seabed is affected only when an activity impacts on what's called the solum. Then the solum is effectively the surface of the seabed. So the Crown claims rights over things like moorings or port development, aggregate dredging, subsea data cables, renewable energy, as we talked about before, aquaculture within inside 12 nautical miles, and things like that. But as I said, it doesn't incorporate anything to do with fishing. It doesn't incorporate anything to do with marine navigation, and it doesn't incorporate all mineral rights. So, whilst the Crown has rights over renewable energy exploitation, it has no rights over oil and gas extraction, no rights over subsea coal extraction, and uncertain rights over any deep sea mining that might be undertaken in the future. It has a funny relationship to the UK government because of its statutory basis, and an even funnier relationship to the devolved administrations, particularly in regard as to how they see their obligations in the marine environment. And that's particularly evident in the context of marine planning. Marine planning is a relatively new idea. It came about on the back of the Crown Marine and Coastal Access Act in 2009. European Union had a directive in 2013, and the idea behind marine planning is to ensure that, or to try to ensure that the sea space is utilised in the most efficient way possible. So acknowledging that it operates often in 3 or 4 different dimensions, to see if there were possibilities of having more than one activity occurring simultaneously in the same area. And that's fine, and the Crown Estates really are heavily invested in the idea of marine planning, but they're invested on the basis of the activities that they derive income from not from the ones they don't, and that can cause tension. So, summarise, lots of the approach that the Crown have taken towards the marine altered in the early 2000s, principally in respect of the Bring On Statute, the Bring On Statute Book, the Energy Act and the Climate Change Act. We currently have 15 gigawatts of offshore wind power being formed. This is a sector that only deployed its first wind farm in 2003, North Hoyle, in the UK, on a commercial scale, North Hoyle in the UK. The UK is committed to having 50 gigawatts of renewable energy being supplied by 2050, 30 gigawatts by 2030, which seems like a bit of an ambitious target at the moment. With the emphasis on developing the area for offshore wind, the Crown has shifted its resources. The Marine Department, which when it had a value of 90 million, consisted of 4 people. There's 200 people working in it. Some very skilled people doing some very interesting things in terms of data analysis and geology and marine planning. Because of this unique status and obligation, it has, with the general duty, it has implications to other elements of security, though. In the marine environment, we from the fishing sector, we've always thought about food security as being a driver. Crown don't have any influence on that, or any interest in that. One of the big concerns for society at the moment is maritime security. The Crown are conflicting a lot with maritime security requirements at the moment. I think there's and all these are implications because of the general duty that it has. So there's some tension inside the government in respect of that. So where does the Crown go? As I just mentioned, there are obligations that the government has to meet net zero. That's going to lead to an increasing amount of the seabed which is utilised for what are effectively offshore power stations. Currently, around the European shelf, there are 46,500 square kilometres of area which are used for those. The UK is unique in a European context in that it does allow activities to occur inside the framework of those sites because of these inalienable public rights. Most European countries have effectively no-go zones. So a modern wind farm that's looking to produce a gigawatt, 1.2 gigawatt, is probably going to encompass 300 or 400 square kilometres of space. And that's a big change for lots of people and lots of activities. I mentioned before about the sectors that the Crown has derives value from. It clearly is supporting the development of those sectors, but that comes at the cost of the sectors that it doesn't. And because the Crown has this unique objective to develop and other statutory bodies don't, then those other sectors are supported by statutory agencies that don't have the same objective as the Crown. So it puts them at a disadvantage. So for fishing is seriously concerned about its future at the moment. The Crown operates very much also in the marine environment as a leader across the European shelf area. Some European coastal states don't appreciate the speed of the way it does things or the remit that the Crown has. But clearly the UK shelf borders on Ireland, on the German coastal area, on the Danish coastal area, on the French coastal area. So that there are tensions there which have to be overcome. When I talked about the inalienable public rights before, I think because they stretch so far back in history, I think there's always been an assumption that they would always be there. The Energy Act, whilst also introducing the renewable energy zone, also provided for Crown estates or for operators to extinguish those rights. No one's used that yet, but that's very much, I think, something that might happen in the future. If we refer back to the 2025 amendment and the sale of the territorial seabed, there is a move to effectively privatise the sea underway. and I suspect the insertion in the 2025 amendment, whilst it only applies to the territorial seabed, is a way to divert large corporate entities away from that idea. Certainly in America, an increasing number of data centers are in the process of being deployed in the marine environment. Those offshore in the marine environment. It makes a lot of sense for the data center operators. The Trump administration are clearly supporting that agenda. I think there are serious implications for not just that part of the seabed, because but also in terms of what happens to that part of the seabed. Data centers produce a huge amounts of energy, huge amounts of heat. Deploying them underwater is very efficient for the operators, but I suspect some of that heat will leach out into the water and change the ecosystem. Now that presents a fundamental challenge to wider agendas for marine protection and support and enhancement. So, and then finally, back to the issue of devolution. So 2017, Scotland, which has a huge amounts of coastal area, huge amount of very productive water, and had a huge amount of quite important rural estates for the Crown, decided to leave the Crown Estate. Some parts of the Welsh political scene have including the Welsh Labour, have committed to also obtaining equivalent rights for Wales and fought quite strongly for that to be included in the 2025 Amendment Act. The UK government decided against that at this time. Coincidentally, the Cardiff office opened. Some of the new commissioners are, in the past, the commissioners used to be private landowners, civil servants, but public appointees. Now there are specific Crown Estate commissioners for Wales and for Northern Ireland. I think this is all about showing the love. The Crown is trying to show the love back to the devolved administrations to make greater connections with them, to try and, I suppose, pop the bubble in terms of the drive towards more devolution inside of Wales. I talked a little bit about, Owen mentioned my background in aquaculture and the Menai Strait. So one of the things that I've recently been trying to do is, with the offshore wind farm sector, is to animate a principle called co-location. So that's utilising some of this space that the offshore wind farm developers are occupying for more than one purpose. So completely aligned with the requirements of marine planning and aligned with wider policy objectives in both the Welsh National Marine Plan and the English National Marine Plan. Unfortunately, when you go through that process, you find yourself in a room up against developers that are large corporate entities. And those developers largely see the space that they're building their wind farm on, in kind of for rational reasons, as their own. And they want to deter any other activity as far as possible. So we've been looking at various different ways that we can use legal levers to try and facilitate some greater connection. We have a long-standing dialogue with an operator, or the operator of the Gwynter Moor site, and we've got tacit sort of agreement to utilise some of the area immediately adjacent to the Gwynter Moor site as a kind of, let's just see how this works kind of scenario, hopefully building trust between us and the developer, or the aquaculture sector and the developer, because the offshore wind farm operators have always fallen back on the fact that they don't understand enough about aquaculture. They feel it's too risky an activity, too uncertain to allow them to embrace it. So that's one of the things that we're moving towards. How far that will go, time will only tell.
Sorry, can I just ask?
Sorry.
Who is we?
Who's we?
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, so company. It's not you know, I mean, the aquaculture sector, Robin, is a very small sector. So it's individual companies at the moment. in terms of sort of wider awareness in the shellfish world, it's hard enough to develop in the open sea environment anyway. To get the required permissions, I'm sort of trying to kind of look a bit further into the future. The problem that we face in terms of activating co-location as a principle is we only have one shot at getting the operator to agree, and that's during their planning process. If we don't insert some obligation on the developer to agree at that stage, then for the 60-year period that they have their lease, they don't have any obligation to do it, and they won't do it. So we're trying to sort of get ahead of the game a little bit at the moment and do that. But it's been quite frustrating, and anyway.
Thank you.
That's broadly it.
Thank you very much indeed. This raises so many questions. Sorry, it raises so many questions. Can I just? So when you say that you've got a wind farm and you want to operate aquaculture adjacent to that wind farm, what sort of activity would that be?
It would be what we call low trophic aquaculture. So mussels, oysters, scallops. Mussels, scallops probably, grown on what are called subsurface long lines. So it would involve the deployment of some infrastructure, anchors and rope lines into the water column in the area adjacent to the area, but in a very sort of spatially discrete space.
And you're saying that there's really no reason for a wind farm owner to object to that because it doesn't cause them any problems?
The new wind farms, so the 1.2 gigawatt wind farms that are currently under construction at the moment. In between each turbine, so if you think of a wind farm, it's so 4 turbines here, you know, it's a block. So there are 1,200 meters in between, or 1,450 meters in between each turbine.
Okay.
So there's a space of 96 hectares, leaving a 500 meter safety zone around each wind turbine and each corner that you could be using for another activity. But the wind farm operators are just saying, no, it's our space.
But the Crown Estate has a responsibility to develop, so you're saying that they
Well, the Crown Estate have a responsibility to develop, and they give the principal lease to the wind farm company. And what the Crown Estate say is if they then give a secondary lease, that undermines the value of the principal lease.
Right.
So that is where the discussion has been for 15 years, to be honest. So.
Okay, so just for clarification, then we'll throw it open to questions. On the Scottish issue, so the Scots broke away the Crown Estate. Does that mean they get the revenue?
Yes.
From go straight to the Scottish government?
Yes.
So has there been any advantage to Scotland in doing? Did they get more revenue subsequent to doing it than they did before? And are they now responsible for running this? Are they doing it well?
So where do you want to start on that one? In terms of I think the revenue is broadly the same.
Okay.
So the Crown are a very professional organisation. They're good at what they do, and they were good in Scotland at what they did. When it was bought in-house, there is a body called the Crown Estate Scotland. Rather than the money being, or rather than the legislation requiring it to act separately from the Scottish Government's requirement, it is now encompassed under the banner of Scottish Government's requirements. So it comes under, there's a principle called the public trust doctrine, which is the way that most coastal states operate the ownership of their marine zone. So it's effectively that the government has a policy to do X, Y, and Z inside its marine area, it can do that. The Crown Estate Scotland is now populated by Scottish civil servants, and the Scottish civil servants have a Scottish civil servant agenda, and that's not quite the same as the Crown Estate's agenda.
Right.
I think objectively, the Crown Estate Scotland is running probably as well now in 2025 as it was in 2017, but it's taken 8 years to get there. I think there's has to be an adjustment of culture inside of for the officials who have been put into Crown Estate Scotland to change the way that they practice.
So you're so familiar with these issues. I mean, you may not want to answer this, but do you think it would be a good idea for Wales to separate from the Crown Estate and have its own officials running it for a Welsh agenda and get much the same revenue, or do you think that would not be a good idea? I'd
like it in principle. I'd support it.
Okay.
I've worked too closely with Welsh Government for too many years to have that much faith in the quality of Welsh Government civil servants. Unfortunately, frankly, I think in principle, I think absolutely. I mean, if Scotland was giving it, then why wouldn't Wales and Northern Ireland be offered the equivalent rights? I think there's a principle that was set, and it just seems completely unfair and blind that the other devolved administrations at least shouldn't be given the opportunity to see if they want to take that. In practice, I think I've got more reservations in practice. But then things how it would actually function.
How it would work. And just one last thing before we throw it open. On the Menai case you've mentioned 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
Can you just give us a sort of 1-minute version of what that was about and what was involved?
Okay, so for the sailors in here, sorry. It was, we in the Menai Strait we operate, or the seabed cultivation industry operated under what was called a fishery order, inside the framework of a fishery order, which was, it's created by secondary legislation, and the order in the Menai Strait was created in 1962 for the specific purpose of farming described shellfish, mussels and oysters in the case of the Menai Strait. During the process of applying for that order, we had to, or any applicant at the time had to seek Crown's permission.
1962.
1962.
Yeah.
And all the way up to 2009, actually. Had to seek Crown's permission to use the ground for the purpose of what's called a several fishery. And the Crown routinely would provide this permission without actually any real caveats. In the Menai case in 2005, so when the order had, considerable, or 2004 it started, no, 2004, actually started in 1998, a considerable period of time to run. A developer wanted to build a marina on one of the areas which was actively used for mussel cultivation.
Okay.
That caused a conflict with the way in which the secondary legislation was ordered, and also other developmental legislation around activities in the marine environment was focused. The Crown Estate supported the developer's application because it said that it had voluntarily given permission for the activity for the fishery order to be undertaken in 1962. Now it wanted to take that permission back because it had this general duty to maximise the income it was going to derive from it. And in the end, the case swung on these inalienable public rights. So because we were operating a several fishery, it was still constituted as part of the public fishery. And the developer couldn't square the circle in terms of not impacting other significant users of the seabed whilst the fishery still existed. And so that case was fought in the High Court and then the Supreme Court and in the House of Lords, which, because it's happened in 2009, so which preceded the Supreme Court. So it's a very strong finding.
And the marina never happened.
And the marina never happened.
Right.
And then 2022, the mussel industry collapsed because of Brexit.
Oh, so now the marina could happen because there's not much. Yeah, okay. Well, it's an absolutely fascinating account. And just one brief point I'd make is that a lot of this legislation you've described, I imagine, went through on a cross-party basis without much controversy and has created a massive industry for Britain in terms of offshore wind.
Absolutely.
And it shows the sort of thing that happens in Parliament away from all the day-to-day political scrapping, which actually delivers and has delivered Britain, presumably, a really good industry, which has happened by consensus.
I think it's absolutely still the case that the UK is a leader in offshore wind. China's catching up very fast, but it's kicked the door down, and it completely changed the way that we see, I think, renewable energy.
Yeah.
So
let's get to questions. There's one there at the back. Yes, I'll come to you. Yep.
Thank you so much for opening some windows on what seems like a real mystery to many of us. Very many people in the room will be really interested in clean water. And I'm aware of some research in Belfast Lough, cleaning up the loch by putting oyster beds in, and it's really delivering. And I wonder how well these committees that sit on this Crown Estate understand how it's about more than revenue.
Sure.
And I only ever understood it was the foreshore that they owned. But that's really interesting that they could have complete control over taking some of this innovation and sharing it across the UK.
So the Northern Irish legislation that governs the Crown is slightly different from England and Wales, but they certainly do own the seabed too. I mean, they operate through a particular agent in Belfast called Fraser McConnell. That's the party that provides the value for the leases, the operators of the sea. You know, there are mussel farms in Belfast Lough, and they have to pay a lease to the Crown for their activity. In terms of the sort of bioremediation possibilities that come from filter feeding bivalves like mussels and oysters, absolutely, I think it's well established. But to be fair to the Crown, I think one of the things they've recently done is they have funded nature restoration projects where they've tried to reintroduce native oyster populations. So in Belfast, and also, I mean, even though they're divorced from Scotland, they've part funded Scottish activities too, and part funded some activities in Conway. Does that mean that will clean up the water? I'm not sure. I think you've got why is the water as polluted as it is at the moment? And I think you can look at decades of underinvestment in infrastructure. Northern Ireland's an interesting case. NI Water is a public-owned body. Belfast itself, in terms of the urban population, has expanded significantly over the last 20 years with no real infrastructure increase. So the water quality in Belfast is absolutely on a downward spiral at the moment. But it's a big issue around the rest of the coastline of the UK. I think the Crown, though, are quite kind of marginal in terms of that debate. I think rightly the focus of people's concern and anger is directed at the utility providers and because they're effectively they're the polluters, but they're being facilitated for a long time by government doing that. So kind of an answer, but not really. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting talk.
Rambling.
Learned a lot about things I knew nothing about. Two questions. One, you talked about excess profits being returned to the Crown. So I'm interested to know what the profit principle is that is used to support the leaseholders as well as support the objectives of the Crown to enhance the usage of marine environment. And the second question, just back to what you said about offshore wind farms and the potential opportunity of aquaculture being developed around wind farms. I'm wondering whether the wind farm itself enhances the quality of that aquaculture. Or, I mean, why an interest now? Why wasn't it developed before the wind farms came around?
Sure. So in terms of the revenue, any excess revenue gets passed to the Treasury. So this is where the Crown Estate are a very protected body, not only by statute, but because their kind of friendly government is the UK Treasury.
What's the definition of excess revenue?
They have costs associated with their activity. So their profit last year, I think their net profit was 1.6 billion. 400 million or so were on internal costs, so their office space, their staff, the things like that. So I mean, it's purely cost, internal cost. They pay their staff quite well. Their chief executive has been in post since 2018 or 19. He joined. His salary was 560,000. His salary this year is 1.3 million. So, but he's. I think over that. I mean, it's shocking, but I mean, it's a cliche. But he's a chief executive. He's running a big organisation that is delivering increased value every year. So I think you could look at other private sector organisations and say, well, it's equivalent to that. But yeah, and they have the commissioners. They get paid a stipend. I think each commissioner gets paid 50 grand. They have 400 staff, I think, overall. They rely on for delivery of lots of their kind of the granular activities on agents. The agents don't get paid, but they get a fee reimbursement. So I think overall that takes up 400 million. Last year, I think it's well known that the return to King Charles in terms of the civil list benefit was 123 million or 133 million, which was a historic high. It will significantly fall back next year because the one of the main components of the marine profit anyway was what they call round 4 option leases, and those cost the wind farm operators a lot of money. Next year that will drop back to from 1.1 billion they think to 52 billion, or 52 billion rather. So it's a big drop. But then they have round 5 leases on the horizon coming up, so it's not forever.
And the second question was,
So,
is it easier to grow aquaculture in a wind farm?
No, so look, I think I have sympathy for the wind farm operators in a way. So why didn't aquaculture operators decide that they wanted to operate in these places before? Well, simply because aquaculture activities are very small, and big ships would go through them, and or more would be more like so there's a de facto spatial there's a spatial restriction that exists inside these areas now, and I think that's the ethos, that it's not just aquaculture developers. I think it's lots of other people that would like to co-locate inside the framework, sort of building on, is that okay, so these are de facto exclusion areas, they're sort of yours, but you're not using all of them, so it makes good social sense to share them. But that's a hippie liberal idea, and if you're talking to hard-nosed corporate entities and they're saying no, they're ours, go away, kind of thing. So it's, anyway.
James, it's me. Thanks very much for a great talk. I'm somebody who is familiar with the electrophysiology of the byssus retractor muscle of the Mytilus. And so obviously I know they can hang on very tightly. But the question I wanted to ask was, you talked about planning being the real entry point to trying to get some leverage on the developers. And what I wanted to know was how much stuff is in planning at the moment, how many square kilometres of wind farmage is there for you to have a go at?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we just completed the latest and probably last round in this part of the Irish Sea for development. So there were 3 wind farms being proposed, or 4 actually. One off the Isle of Man, one called Mona, one called Morecambe, one called Morgan, Morecambe, and Mona. Sorry, alliteration does me. So they in total covered 660 square kilometres of space, and the applicant for development was BP and EDWN, I think, who are a German pension fund. And so we tried to engage with them and basically got the straight back through the planning inspectorate thing. So it's a very complicated process, and the wind farm companies are required to produce a huge amount of evidence in order to conform with the requirements of planning and environmental needs and things like that. However, perhaps I'm cynical, but sometimes they say they've done something completely, and they refer you to document 17, paragraph 5, subsection 4, footnote 2, and of course you can't find that, and then so they shut your question down, and then you've got time to look at it, and it doesn't say anything that like they've said it does, but you've lost your opportunity. And I think that's corporate play, and I don't know. I think I am quite concerned about the privatisation of oceans. Actually, I think the ocean surface, oceans cover 72% of the sea surface. They're the biggest global carbon sink. They play an important role in terms of how the Earth moderates its climate. The more industrial things that we do in the oceans, that's clearly going to have an effect on these wider kind of services that the ocean provides for us. And I think it only takes one domino to fall, and the other ones will fall quickly. Outside of the exclusive economic zones, it's called the high seas. And the high seas are basically, they're somewhere between kind of regulated by polite convention and the Wild West. And so when many people might have read about deep sea mining and nodules and stuff like that. So there is an international body called the International Seabed Mining Authority. Zero teeth. You know, I think, you know, we've got competing priorities. We've got a very strong economic, financial agenda for big companies to just go ahead and do these things. We don't know anything about the deep sea, anything at all. You know, and I think these companies will happily go ahead and just rip it apart. It might hold the key to future cancer cures, you know, but that will all be destroyed, I think, in the rush to get money. So
but what you're saying is that that this legislation that says the seabed can't be permanently disposed of means that any control that a wind farm company or big corporation has is limited.
to a 60-year lease.
Right.
But I have to say a movable 60-year. The leases used to be 25 years. Well, they were 10 years, 25 years, 60 years. I suspect they'll end up being in 90 years or 150. So it's
Yep.
Menai mussels,
oh, yes.
they are fantastic. They're lovely. You've mentioned them a couple of times in your talk, and you said it's affected the business. Brexit's affected the business of Menai mussels. In which way? Are they going to be off the menu in the future?
I haven't left the shop, and amongst other things, and you know, it's the probably, you know, there's a fish shop in Bentley, there's a fish shop in Bangor, that's me. There's one in Llandudno. I sell 30 kilos of mussels a week. 30 kilos. Before Brexit, when we had full access to the single market, when we were a member of the European Union, the regulatory regime applied differently to us. The quality, the water quality that we exist under, which isn't our fault, was adequate. Wasn't great. Was adequate for us. We could sell the product directly to where the market demand was, which is continental Europe. So the sector was very big. The Menai Straits is very productive. Because of the geographical nature of it, you know, tide rushes in and goes out twice a day. Huge amounts of energy and protein comes in with that. Great place to grow mussels. We could grow 10,000 tons of mussels there a year. The domestic demand for mussels, probably 200 tons. I mean, there's 4,000 or 5,000 tons domestic demand, but there are plenty of other people who fill that space already. It's not demand that's growing. So the recent announcement a couple of months ago by the UK government to normalise relationships with the European Union, to look at the creation of a phytosanitary agreement is great for us, I think, potentially, if it allows us to access a single market with adequate quality water. You know, but that's the question. So that's the devil's in the detail, really. We don't know enough about that.
But you've gone down from how many tons to how many tons?
Well, 10,000 to, I mean, the first year, 10,000 to nothing. So, yeah, so, I mean, we had 4 boats working there. We had 30 people. There are 2 people working there in 1 boat. So, yeah.
Yeah.
But is that because the European countries cannot buy your mussels?
We can't get them into the single market.
You can't get them into the single market?
No, so clearly as a third country single market, the UK has to do different things in terms of its food exports. So for live animal, we used to sell the mussels to Europe as food. After we left the single market, we had to sell them as live animal exports. Those exports, if they were live bivalve mollusks, could only come from grade A waters. We don't have grade A waters, and that was the issue. So
James, I understand that the Mediterranean mussels are going south, though, so it might be an opportunity.
The what, sorry?
Mediterranean mussels, because it's too hot.
I think there are sort of persistent mortality issues in Spain, which is the principal growing area in Europe, in northwest of Spain, Maitland Provincial, but it's not the same product. And so what they in Spain, they tend to they grow a lot. It's quite big. It grows quite quickly, and they can it. The Mytilus edulis we grow here is a smaller animal. It doesn't really work so well in cans. But yeah, we'll see. I think. But I mean that's like, yeah. So benefiting from somebody else's pain. So yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Robin, don't ask me a difficult question.
No.
No law.
No. On the contrary, I want to ask you a really simple question. I'm still trying to understand how the power works. You know, in the decisions. So you've got this concept of marine planning.
Yeah.
So by analogy with town and country planning. You know, we have a system with local authorities and so on. So who is the planner? We have planning authorities on the land. So in marine planning, who is the planner?
Welsh Government. Welsh Government in Wales, Marine Management Organisation, UK Government in Westminster in England. But the interesting thing is that there are two marine planning systems in play at the moment, even though only one is acknowledged. So there's the Crown Estate Marine Spatial Planning process.
So that's it deciding for itself.
Deciding for itself, and that is supposed to operate underneath the banner of the Welsh but it doesn't. It operates in advance of it. And it's much better, much more highly resourced, much more specific, much more data rich. It's a better system because they have more resources and the people are, quite frankly, professional. You know, I engage with the Welsh marine planning process, and I've engaged with it since it started. So in 2009, and we had a Welsh National Marine Plan produced in 2017 or 2018. And it's got lots of fantastic aspirations to it, but not a single one of those have ever been enacted.
Right.
So we did try and pull the Welsh Marine Plan levers when we were trying to during the recent planning process particularly with the Mona wind farm, because that was encompassed inside the framework of the Welsh marine area entirely, and Welsh Government just weren't interested at all in some of their policy requirements.
Right.
So,
right. Thanks. Just one other thing.
Yep.
Who appoint the process of appointment of commissioners?
it's a public appointment process.
Yeah.
So it's run effectively by UK government, but the interview panel is an internal interview panel with the Crown Estate. So they have a chair and the chief executive and their human resource person and a representative from the UK government on the interview panel. But it's a UK public appointee process. So,
Oh, thank you very much. Most interesting thing. I'm fascinated with the idea of mussel farming. I know nothing about it. I've seen it, the mussels collected on the swags of rope and posts. Presuming that you've set up your infrastructure, does this need a lot of maintenance? It sounds as if you have all the year-round harvest. Do you have to go out daily and pull these mussels physically off the ropes? Or is there a machine which does this? Or do the mussels let go and swim around?
A day in the life of a mussel farmer, please.
Just in case
so
I get left
it's
on a desert island and have to do it myself.
You need to know these things.
I mean, look, I've mussels. I could get very messianic about mussels. They're amazing. They are amazing animals. But in terms of growing them on ropes, it's quite intensive. So when they reproduce, mussels have a larval stage. So mussels are male and females. When they release, well, what happens first of all? The males will release sperm in the water. That'll cause the females to release eggs. They'll be externally fertilized. They float around in the water column for a long period of time, driven by currents or wind. And so they're effectively until they find something to settle on, and then they metamorphose and become small mussels and start to grow very rapidly. So with ropes, you don't in this part of the world you can just deploy ropes as you could deploy moorings, or if you leave a boat anchored anywhere for a long period of time, and they will settle on the outside on the surface of that material or thing. The thing to do then when you cultivate them is to try and stop them suffocating each other, dropping off and dying, because they're growing so rapidly. They occupy a very small space of time. So where you might have you might find in a meter square area of say rope, or a meter length of rope, you might find 10 million juvenile mussels. When they settle, they're about 0.5 millimeter in size. So you might find 10 million of these in 0.5 millimeter of space. Within a month of settling, those 0.5 millimetre mussels will be about 3 or 4 millimetres in size. So unless you do something with lots of those mussels, many of them will just get suffocated out and die. So the idea, I mean, it's very difficult to intervene at that early life stage, but as they get bigger, that kind of dynamic follows its way all the way through. So when you cultivate them on the rope, what you're trying to do is stop them getting too dense on the rope. So you're stripping, you're cleaning off the ropes and putting them back on the ropes and cleaning them off and putting them back on until they complete their life cycle and reach a size where they're ready for market. We've worked quite a long time with Bangor University to sort of get a technological understanding of this. So we know that if we grow them on the seabed, it takes about 3 years for that cycle to complete. In the water column on the ropes, it takes about a year. But it's a lot more intense. So which is fine when the weather's not blowing, when the wind's not blowing, which of course it does quite often here. That's the big challenge of not just co-location but moving cultivation offshore. There's a lot of space out there. There's a lot of nutrition. You can grow things very quickly, but logistics are a real issue.
So when your production collapsed after Brexit,
yeah,
you weren't doing that intensive work, so there were just fewer of them around.
On the seabed,
or on the ropes.
Well, we had a funded project that still had a year to run, so we carried on doing it for a year after that. But then the money ran out. So
yeah, there's a question at the front here, and there'll be two. Yeah, we'll come to you.
You said that the domestic market is tiny for mussels. So has they're high in protein, so that it's a nutritious product. Has the mussel industry or yourself, or would you consider processing the meat and presenting it to the UK consumer in some manner that they would find more palatable or easier to cook?
No, I mean, I think people. I mean, we've looked at that over the last 3 or 4 years. Squaring the economic circle or the financial is a bit difficult. The value chain's very different, but no, absolutely. I think we've looked. I think in many ways. No, I mean, Brexit for me has been a disaster, but it's made us think very differently about what we do, and it's forced us to revisit some assumptions that we had sort of were strongly held in terms of where the best, most stable markets were, and so I think as soon as before the end of the transition period in 21, we'd started to look at alternative markets, but. If I can just make I mean, you're right. Mussels are highly nutritious. They're relatively cheap. They grow very quickly. They've got essential minerals inside of them, vitamins, etc., etc. But people don't eat enough of them in this country, right? We could sell them for. I mean, when we used to sell, we'd sell in bulk by a wagon load or by a ton. So a ton of mussels, £800. That would take us 3 years to grow on the seabed, which sounds like a long time, but for us that was we'd have to bring the juveniles in and lay them on the seabed. We'd have to make sure that not too many of them were eaten by predators, so we'd do some potting or stuff like that to keep the predators off them, and then we'd move them further down the seabed after a year until they got to market size, and then we'd sell them. So there wasn't a huge amount of human invention. So it was, even though it took 3 years, it was quite profitable when it worked. To sell them into as an additive, you're probably looking at £300 a tonne for a whole mussel product, because the only bit of that mussel which is interesting to people is the meat inside. And so to get the meat outside of the product and to process it into a format where it would be useful as a value-added material costs a lot of money, and then the market will only pay X for it. So you've got to meet that demand. So, but I think there are economies of scale to be found in doing that. So I think, in mussel sector Mark II or whatever happens in the future, we will have a much more sort of blended supply chain, they call it. So some will go to the live market in Europe, but some will go to these other things. So, value-added products, protein, pet food, things like that. So, you know, and I think we'll use more of the animal too. So instead of just focusing on the meat, we'll look at the shell. The shell has certain minerals which are useful. It takes some processing to get them out, but it's good. The mussel beard that people talk about it's called a byssus, and the byssus has some incredibly interesting enzymes associated with it. So people have looked at the byssus to as an extractive for things. But again, that I think when you look at things in a experimental way, even if you try really hard to get a good idea of costings, you know, all they are is indicative. So I think all these things are interesting for the future, but they certainly weren't an answer for us for the present. So.
Right, and basically I was listening to just, what you were saying about the mussel farming.
Yeah.
A bit closer.
Oh, sorry, closer, right, okay. And you mentioned something about the water quality being not too good in the Straits. Is that correct? I mean, and obviously the other thing was, do mussels actually improve the quality of the water? Because I know years ago, you know, before I came here, I've talked to mates who live on the island, and the Straits were pretty dire in terms of the quality. So I'd just like a few comments on that, if I could.
Sure. So the way that people assess water, or the quality of an area for the purpose of shellfish, is they grade it into 3 grades: A, B, and C. So in order to determine where you are on those grades, you have to sample the mussels a number of times per year. So what we do at the moment is we sample. We've got 8 leased areas inside the Menai Strait. So we sample each of those areas 13 times a year on a monthly basis, more or less. To meet A-grade criteria, there has to be less than 230 E. coli found in 100 millimetres of sort of mulched up mussel flesh. Any more than 230, less than 4,600, we're in grade B, and more than 4,600, we're in grade C, and you can't do anything with them. So for a long time, the Menai Strait was grade B. So grade B is quite a wide boundary. We were quite close to grade A. Sometimes we'd be in grade A, sometimes we'd be in grade B. But unfortunately for us, the end of the transition period, we were grade 3 or 4 of the 8 areas were grade A when we came to the end of the EU-UK transition period, but we'd had COVID lockdown that year. And the Food Standards Agency, who administered that system, said that we hadn't taken enough samples of the mussels to reach minimum requirements to assess the quality of the water for that year. And because of lockdown, because nobody had. And anyway, so we were penalised. So then they downgraded us back to grade B. So when we were faced with these new trading conditions, we were effectively shut down because of an administrative thing and COVID.
But generally, it's fairly clean.
It's a lot cleaner than it used to be. For example, I think, you know, I think society still uses the sea as a sewer, right? So, but a lot less than it used to. Up until 1998, we used to sludge dump from the Mersey, and the sludge dumping location was sort of 5 miles off Puffin Island, and so the residual flow of water would be bringing stuff back into the Straits. It made things very productive in the Straits because there was lots of nutrition, but maybe not the best nutrition. And what was really interesting is when they stopped sludge dumping, the ecosystem really collapsed for 3 or 4 years. Until it kind of reached the new status quo. It took a while to kind of recover and sort of what the hell's happening. But yeah, no, I mean, I think the waters have been generally improving, albeit up until the last couple of years. And then, for whatever reason, I don't understand whether it, certainly for in our experience, the trend, which was getting better, like that, has started to go like that. Whether that's the way that it's not just water utility providers. We live in an agricultural catchment, so you know, agricultural practice has, you know, I saw a statistic somewhere, and they were talking about slurry. So a cubic meter of slurry is 300 times more full of bacteria than a cubic meter of human fecal matter. because it's just concentrated bacteria. And so if this has been, I think farmers, they have to get rid of their slurry, so they put it onto the field. If they get it on the field and it rains, it gets washed down the watershed. That can pulse a lot of bacteria into the water
But
column.
that's not changed over the last 2 years, is it?
I just noticed when I was coming in today, we do see a lot more intensive dairy on the land, and I think so. I think intensive dairy. I think intensive dairy. You change the practice, and I think one of the things that the farmers are really keen to do is dry out the land they're using, so they clear a lot of the ditches that would have otherwise maybe held water back a little bit. So, but no, I think it has been on the downward trend. Dore Cymru have just invested £24 million in building a huge storage tank in Bangor, where the football pitches were, which is something that we've been asking them to do for 30 years. So thank you. A bit late, but we'll have to see what happens there. They have a tertiary or secondary pumping works in Bangor that used to, strangely and very coincidentally, always break down when it was foggy and release raw sewage into the mussel beds. It was the weird, strangest thing. So, so I don't think that'll be happening anymore. So,
a quick one. How do you stay sane and even optimistic post Brexit and the challenges that you've had?
Do I ever come across that way?
Relatively.
I used to do drugs and alcohol. I'd say sex, but I don't get any of that anymore. So.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? Yeah, there's one at the back. Yeah.
So
you're going to ask for any cheap fish?
So how do Anglesey sea salt get away with it?
Well, because I guess in terms of the water quality, because they're crystallizing salt. They're taking salt water and it's salt crystals, isn't it? And one of the things that was most frustrating for me in respect of the new arrangements that we faced post Brexit was that they were wrapped up inside bureaucratic speak associated with food risk, and there was no increase in food risk whatsoever. There's a perception that exists, and with some cause, mostly due to oysters, that if you grow live bivalve moss in water which is contaminated with bacteria, so more bacteria than 230 count, or bacteria, and actually it's not spoken but virus, then you're likely, or there's a possibility that the consumer then will get sick eating the product. And that's very true for things that you eat raw. But if the animal's effectively cooked, so if heat is applied to the animal, so it destroys the viral content and it destroys the bacteria. So what do you do with the sea salt? You're just cooking it all, aren't you? So I think there's so much heat associated with the creation of sea salt that it's just this pure, wonderful, fresh, unique.
You don't have to say that, but it does rely on the Gulf Stream bringing clean water in, and rigorous testing shows no.
I'm sure on top of everything else.
But the Gulf Stream comes southwest and goes through the straits and on.
That's very interesting. So it'd be more difficult to do what you do on the other end of the strait.
Yes.
Okay. Right. We'll come in a minute.
Good evening, thank you. Apologies if this seems a little trivial, but I've got to be in my bonnet about this one. Given that we have the right to navigation, and the Crown Estate owns the beach up to the mean high water mark, and all those property owners with houses on the beachfront own the rest of the beachfront, do you know if Anglesey County Council have a legal right to charge us for registering our vessels and paying to launch them?
Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I do understand. So Anglesey have a lease with the Crown Estate. So I think it's, if I remember rightly, it's not my thing, but I think it's like a rolling 10-year lease with the Crown Estate for that purpose. So they pay the Crown a sum of money. I don't think it's a huge amount of money. I think this is again where the Crown's very, very sort of strange. So it operates for the purpose of maximising the return it derives, but it also has this sort of public purpose too. So I think with local authorities, they're able to lease stuff, perhaps not at a commercial rate, but it certainly has as far as I'm aware, like a long, sort of a 10-year rolling lease or something. And I think it operates both sides. It operates that for the Gwynedd side as well, so it has the remit on the Gwynedd side as well. But
yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Can you explain to me about the rule about ore in the month and whether there's any scientific basis to it? But that's my first question.
The rule being?
You're not supposed to eat oysters with the oysters are in the month. That's the general rule, and it was associated, I think, with the spawning condition of with the reproductive status of the oysters as much as anything else. But coincidentally, it sort of coincides with the maximum period of likely noroviral contamination in the water as well. But it was associated mostly with native oysters, which of course we don't see so many of them before.
So it's got not a lot to do with mussels anyway?
No, not a lot to do with mussels. No.
Oh, okay,
No,
that's a great relief. So the second question is, besides the obvious thing of supporting the local economy by shopping in your shop in Bangor, what particular fish types should we buy from your shop or elsewhere that would ensure the support of the local economy? So supporting local fishermen. What's the local catch?
Whelks, yeah. Slimy, horrible, tough whelks. And we have the Irish Sea is like a big deep sea fjord, and excepting David just said about the Gulf Stream coming in from the north. So we have 2 points of entry to the Irish Sea. We have the Celtic Sea boundary, and then you have the opposite Northern Ireland and Loch Rye and Stranraer, that sort of thin channel there. There's not a huge amount of water that's exchanged between the two areas. And because of the shape of the Irish Sea, it's sort of, we have, on this side, we have the sort of tidal and sand flats of Liverpool Bay, which then drop off in the middle into this relatively deep sort of ravine type, and then across the Irish Sea onto the east coast of Ireland, you've got a smaller kind of flat shelf. It's not great for biological productivity. The sharper shelf on the eastern Irish Sea or the western, well, on the east coast of Ireland, is much more productive than our side of the Irish Sea. So in terms of fish to buy, sea bass are the principal finfish species that's landed here. Whiting used to be a very prolific species until the 1980s. Then climate change and a bit of overfishing altered that. There's signs that they're coming back. Not many people will eat whiting, find it a bit too watery. Crab, lobster, cockles, lots of stuff that live underneath the seabed. So scallops, for example, one of the most productive scallop fisheries in the UK is in Cardigan Bay, and a bit further north. So things like that are very productive here.
Okay, well, I think we've had a very good account of the Crown Estate and the various issues on the Strait and so on. So we're very, very grateful to you. I think everyone should shop in your shop. Where is it?
In Port Penryn, Bangor.
So where is that exactly?
Oh, in Port Penryn, Bangor. So if you, it's the dock in Bangor.
On the dock in Bangor.
On the dock in Bangor. Yeah.
So you go down and see the bay.
Yeah, if you drive onto the dock proper, we're the only building on the right hand side of the dock. So.
I think we can all agree if Wales gets control of the Crown Estate in Wales, you should be running it. We'd like you.
If they're going to if they're paying me £1 million, then absolutely.
There is that. So thank you very much indeed for coming to us. Brilliant.